الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. So as we continue discussing the book Bulugh Maram by Hadith Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani rahimahullah ta'ala, and we are covering Bab Kitab al-Tahara, so matter relating to Tahara. And in the last session that we had we had started discussing a new Bab, a new chapter, which is Bab al-Tayammum, so matter that relates to Tahara, amongst those things that will be covered in the books of the books of fiqh and also the books of Hadith al-Ahkam. They'll discuss matter relating to al-Tayammum. So in the last session that we had mentioned a hadith that the author started with, where he mentioned 3 hadith in opening discussion regarding Tayammum and its Ahkam. So he mentioned the hadith of Jabir ibn Abdullah, also the hadith of Hudayfa, and also the hadith of Ali. So we had mentioned more the hadith of Jabir by making takhrij of the hadith of Jabir ibn Abdullah. Also we discussed the general meaning of that hadith, and then we went into discussing matters relating to Tayammum as a way of as an introduction as to matters into Tayammum, that we had covered what is Tayammum by stating what is meant or discussed or what is explained as what is Tayammum linguistically and also Shar'an. So the ulama, they'll make a distinction of Tayammum, and they mention Tayammum mean al-qasd, and also that Tayammum, that we mentioned that there's different several definitions that have been given as to what is Tayammum, but so we discussed that matter. Then also we discussed or mentioned regarding the Tariq. So also the Tariq, as mentioned by the Fuqaha and the Ulama, that Tayammum, that when it was legislated. So they mentioned that Tayammum, that it was legislated, as mentioned by Sheikh Abdullah Fawzan, that in his explanation, that Tayammum, it was legislated in the 6th year of the Hijrah, in Fi Ghazwatul Mustaliq. So in this battle that occurred, where Aisha anhu, and the story that Aisha ta'ala anha, that she lost her necklace, and while searching for it, that it took some time, and they're without water. So the ayah, the verse of Tayammum, it was revealed. So that's concerning. So Tayammum was legislated during that incident with Aisha, and during that battle, then Tayammum was revealed. Then also we discussed matter regarding concerning that general benefit that we can take from the hadith. So today, inshaAllah ta'ala, and also we discussed that is Tayammum something which is particular this ummah or compared to other nation. So that's concerning, and we discussed regarding concerning the hadith of Jabir that is mentioned, that it kind of somewhat outlined the Prophet ﷺ, he was giving 5 things that others were not given before him, meaning concerning the Anbiya. So the Prophet ﷺ was giving 5 things, so 5 things that were particular and specific to the Prophet ﷺ, not giving to anyone before him, and more so regarding the Anbiya and their nations. So the hadith kind of somewhat is specified enough those things that it mentioned, that the Prophet ﷺ, as he states in hadith, ju'ilat li al-ard, that it was granted for me the earth, masjidan, as a place for salah, masjid, and also tahuran, and also a place of purification. I mentioned فَأَيُّمَا رَجُلٍ, so any person, any man, I will mention that this man, it applies to anyone, male or female, min ummati, yani from this ummah, that adakahu as-salah, that the person's salat is upon him, falyusalli, then he should perform his salat. So based upon the person, that wherever he may be, that is allowed to pray at that place, as the earth is considered to be a masjid, so a place of sujood. And also it mentioned regarding tahuran, and also a place for purification, meaning purification, that the person can make tayammum. So we discussed that hadith and of the matter that relates to that particular hadith. Now today, inshaAllah ta'ala, we'll continue discussing the other 2 hadith, with the hadith of Hudayfa, which Ibn Hajar summarized that in the Muslim, and also the hadith of Ali ibn Abi Talib. So we'll have the hadith be read, those 2 read again, and then we'll go into discussing those hadith.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad. Chapter of Tayammum. وفي حديث Hudayfa, in the hadith of Hudayfa, Muslim has, the soil of the earth has been made for us as a means of purification, if such when we do not find water. And Ahmed has, on the authority of Ali radiallahu anh, the soil has been made for me a means of purification.
So those are the 2 hadith that remain with a part of those that discussion. So the Prophet ﷺ mentioned hadith of min hadith Hudayfa in the Muslim and in the Sahih Muslim. where the Prophet ﷺ, the hadith mentioned, جُعِلَتْ تُرْبَتُهَا لَنَا تَحُورًا إِنْ لَمْ يَجِدْ مَا. So the hadith mentioned, so that's the hadith that the turba, the soil of the earth, is being made for us pure. And also it mentioned, إِذَا لَمْ نَجِدَ الْمَاء, if we do not find water. Then the second hadith, so that hadith of Hudayfa, that by way of takhrij of the hadith, I mentioned the hadith in the Sahih Muslim, as I mentioned, that fil hadith Hudayfa in the Muslim. So the hadith is found, or the hadith is referenced back to Imam Muslim in his Sahih. Also the hadith is found in Ahmed in his Musnad, Ibn Khuzaymah in his Sahih, Daraqutni, and also Bayhaqi. So all of whom I've mentioned this particular hadith. So again, of those who have narrated this hadith, collected this hadith, Imam Muslim, Ahmed, Ibn Khuzaymah, Daraqutni, Bayhaqi. And the hadith kind of somewhat, the meaning of the hadith, we said that's a portion of the hadith. So the hadith of Hudayfa is just a part. He does mention just the section, the portion of the hadith that he needs for this particular discussion. So the hadith mentioned, فَضَّلْنَا عَلَى النَّاسِ بِثَلَاثَةٍ, that mentioned that now we were preferred, or we're giving these three things over the people. جُعِلَتْ صُفُوفَنَا كَصُفُوفِ الْمَلَائِكَةِ. So those three things that the Prophet ﷺ was given, that one, that our sufuf was to be that of the angel, to be likened to that of the angels. وَجُعِلَتْ لَنَا, and he mentioned جُعِلَ لَنَا الْأَرْضُ كُلُّهَا مَسْجِدًا, and also we were given that the entire earth is a masjid. وَجُعِلَتْ تُرْبَتُهَا لَنَا تَحُورًا, and also that the soil of the earth, the soil was granted for us as being pure. إِذَا لَمْ نَجِدْ الْمَاء, if we did not find any more water. فَذَكَرَ خَصْلَةً أُخْرَى, and also he mentioned other things that are particular to the Prophet ﷺ. So the hadith can somewhat mention these three things regarding, and the shahid from the hadith is when it mentioned that جُعِلَتْ تُرْبَتُهَا, that the soul of the earth is made for us as something which is pure. Then as for the second hadith of Ali ibn Abi Talib anhu, where the Prophet, the hadith is collected in the Ahmed wal Bayhaqi. So the hadith in the Ahmed wal Bayhaqi, and this hadith of Ali ibn Abi Talib anhu, يقول قال رسول الله عليه وسلم أعطيت أربعا, that I was granted four things. لم يعطيهن أحد من أنبياء الله من أنبياء الله, that I was given four things that none of the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala were given before. أوتيت مفاتيح الأرض, I was given the keys, the treasures of the earth. وسميت أحمد, and I was referred to, I was named Ahmed. وجعلت تراب لي طهورا, and it was granted for me, for the earth, the soil, to be pure for use as purification. وجعلت لي أمتي خير أمة, and also my nation was granted being the best of nations. So these are the four of those things that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned in the hadith of Ali. But we mentioned the author Ibn Hajar, he only mentioned the portion that was needed for this discussion, that relates to the discussion, which is Tayammum. So those hadith, they mention various things that the Prophet ﷺ was given that nations before were not given. And the ulama mentioned that regarding these, what they refer to as khasa'is, things that are particular to the Prophet ﷺ, at times those things are particular to him and him only, and no one else. And also things that are particular to him and also the Anbiya and none others. And things that are particular to him and his nation. So things that are particular to him, the Prophet ﷺ, and also his nations, that they're given, they're allowed of these things also with the Prophet ﷺ included. So that's concerning this hadith that I mentioned, these two hadith. So overall those hadith mentioned, that those hadith that state regarding of those things that we were granted this nation of Muhammad ﷺ, not giving to those before, that for us the earth is a masjid, and also the soil, the things on the earth, that it can be used as a form of purification. So the soil of the earth can be used as a purification. So with this matter being the case, that if we were to combine all those three hadith in the full wording, that will have many of those things that are specific and particular to the Prophet ﷺ that nations before were not granted. So combining all those hadith, those three hadith, that we'll see that there's over 10 or more things that are particular to the Prophet ﷺ and this nation. So as for these matters, that we just first we'll discuss concerning of those matters that regarding the ahkam that can be taken from these hadith. So as for the ahkam relating to this matter, first, we have discussed at-tayammum before. So we'll discuss consider of masail that relates to tayammum. So matters that relates to ahkam that relates to tayammum. The first that is mentioned, tayammum fi safar. What's the ruling regarding a tayammum fi safar? So a person who is traveling as a traveler, is it allowed for the person to make tayammum? On this matter, ijma al-ulama, they mention that the ulama are in agreement as mentioned by Al-Qurtubi in his tafsir. So Al-Qurtubi in his tafsir that they mention ijma al-ulama ala mashru'iyyat at-tayammum fi safar, fi jumla. That ulama are in agreement, in consensus, that it is allowed for a person to perform tayammum while traveling in general. So the general ruling, it is something which is allowed. So it's something ulama, they take it as something which is allowed for a person, a traveler, that he can perform tayammum. The second of those masail that are discussed is the case regarding tayammum fil hadar. So the person who's a traveler, so the person who's stationary in his locality, is not a traveler, but he's a resident, is he allowed tayammum? On that matter, ذهب جمهور أهل العلم, that majority of the ulama, that they take the position it is allowed. So the person who's residential in his locality, at home, in his house, then is that person allowed to perform tayammum? Jumhur, majority of the ulama, take the position it is allowed. And they use regarding these ahadith that where the hadith does not stipulate or make a that doesn't restrict the person who's said to be residential. So they mentioned that the hadith, the Prophet mentioned, ju'ilat li al-ard, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have made for me the ard, masjidan wa tahuran, that the earth is made for me as a masjid, can be used to pray, and also second, that I can use of the earth as a form of purification. So they mentioned that. That's concerning that particular hadith. And another view of the ulama, that is the view taken by Abu Hanifa, إذا أدم مشروعية التيمم في الحضر. That Abu Hanifa, عليه رحمة الله تعالى, that he take the position that it is not allowed, is not mashru', there is no allowance for a person who's residential at home for him to perform tayammum. And he mentioned that because tayammum, according to him, it is specific to the person who's a traveler. And it mentioned regarding ala safarin. So in the ayah that regards concern this matter, that it mentioned ala safarin. So based upon this, he take the position that it is restricted to the person who's traveling. It's a person who's traveling. So that ayah in Surah An-Nisa, verse 43, mentioned أو على سفر. Then it mentioned about tayammum. So you see it as the person is restricted to the person who's in that situation of traveling, but not applying to the person that is residential. As for Jumhur of the ulama, who said it is allowed for resident and also for traveler, that I mentioned in the ayah is concerned to know that it is concerned to know ghalib, that a person while he's traveling, that he may be more in need to perform tayammum because not having that easy access to water, especially of time after the pass. So the person who's traveling is maybe more in need of tayammum because of lack of water or the scarcity of water. So based upon that, he may be more in need of tayammum than a person who's residential at his home, then he has easy access to water. But overall concern is also the hadith, so it is not per se specific. So I mentioned that the ayah is considered kharaja makhraj al-ghalib. The ayah is in relation to a thing that may occur, that in a tayammum may more applicable in case with the person as a traveler compared to the person, unless for the person who's residential. And that may be the case, but it does not forbid and restrict the person who's a resident to make use of tayammum. So that's concerning that matter that is discussed. And qawl al-jumhur al-ulama seem to be more correct. The qawl al-jumhur of the ulama that seem to be more correct. So based upon this, that the ulama take the position that, as mentioned, فَإِذَا تَيَمُّمْ, if a person performs tayammum فصلى, and he prays. ثم وجد الماء في وقته, and he found water, and the time for the salat hasn't come to an end, hasn't expired. So the person performed tayammum, he prayed his salah, compulsory salah, and whatever, and then later on, before the time of that particular salat ends, the person, he finds water. Jumhur of the ulama, they take concern that that person's salat, he does not need to repeat his salah, and his salat is sahih, without needing to repeat his salat. So repetition is not required, because he has done what is required of him. Where he did not find water at that time, he performed tayammum, and he prayed, and he has fulfilled what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prescribed for him, and give him allowance to do. So they mentioned the person's salat is valid, and there's no need for a person to repeat the salat, even though there's still time that a person, time for that salat is still in. So they mentioned that and that's the view taken by Imam Malik, Riwaya, and Ahmed, khilafan li Shafi'i. Shafi's opposite matter, and also Riwaya, where of those who mentioned of Imam Shafi, and also a Riwaya and Imam Ahmed, that a person should repeat his salah. That they take a position that the person in that case should repeat his salat, because he found water and there's still time for him to pray that salat, even though it had been prayed before, so he should repeat his salat. But Allahu Alam, that qawl of those who mention a person does not require to repeat his salat, then that is the more correct view. The next matter they discuss between the fuqaha: does tayammum rafi'un lil hadath or mubih lil ibadah? That does tayammum, it remove the impurities, remove any form of religious impurity upon the person, or is it to be done only to give allowance for the person to pray that salah, or to carry out that act of ibadah? So that's the issue that is discussed with the ulama. Rafi'un lil hadath, does it remove the person from being in a state of impurity to a state of purity, or it's only done tayammum for the person to carry out a specific act of ibadah? So you have that discussion between the ulama. So based upon this, they mention am yubih lima yajib lahu at-tahara faqat. So is it just for him to carry out that act and nothing more? On this matter, Jumhur of the ulama, they take the position that tayammum laysa rafi'an lil hadath. It's not something that removes the person from impurities fully. So it doesn't give the person that state of full purity. So it doesn't rafa al-hadath. It doesn't remove that religious impurity from the person completely. It's only for the person, allowance for the person to pray that salah. It's only an allowance for a person to carry out that act of salah or an act of ibadah. So that's the view taken by Jumhur of the ulama. And that is the call which is mashhur, and they said that Imam Ahmed is the view of Imam Malik, Shafi'i, and others. So that's the view taken by those of the ulama. So they mentioned the hadith, Sa'id wudu al-Muslim, that the hadith of Abi Dharr wa Abu Hurairah radhiyallahu anhuma, where the Prophet of Islam mentioned hadith, Sa'id wudu al-Muslim, that Sa'id, that tayammum, Sa'id in the sense, tayammum is allowed, wudu lil-Muslim is a purification for the mu'min, for the believer. إذا لم يجد الماء, if he does not find water, 10 سنين, even goes for 10 years. فإذا وجد الماء, and if he finds water, فليتق الله, the person of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ويمسه بشرته, and he should make it, he should rub of his applied to his skin. So based upon this, they mention regarding concerning this particular hadith, that we'll discuss further this hadith, but use hadith to say the person, it is only applicable, tayammum is only used for the person to carry out an act of ibadah and nothing more. So if what is so the person is not allowed to do, but for the perform tayammum only for the act that is required. On this matter, you have a second view of the ulama, and that's a view taken by Abu Hanifa, Dawood al-Zahiri, some of the Malikiyah, and a riwayah and Ahmed that I mentioned that tayammum yarfa al-hadath. That tayammum, it removes the person from any form of religious impurities and make him fully in a state of pure tahara. So those view of the ulama of Abu Hanifa, Dawood al-Zahiri, and also Bad al-Malikiyah and riwayah and Imam Ahmed that at-tayammum yarfa al-hadath, that it remove the person from a state of religious impurity to a state of religious purity. And they mention regarding concerning the hadith of Jabir, and the hadith we have mentioned, all these hadith indicates this. The hadith of Jabir, the hadith of Hudayfa, the hadith of Ali, all those hadith indicate that the person is in a state of dimension. Ju'ilat li arda masjidan wa tuhura. And also it mentioned the hadith of Jabir mentioned فَأَيُّمَا رَجُلٍ, any person أَدْرَكَتْهُ الصَّلَاةِ, that salat of upon him, for he can pray. So that's something that shows that, and all the hadith, that is a general purification for the person regarding his salah, regarding acts of ibadah. So based upon this, they mention regarding that, he mentioned tahur is a form of purification, so it kind of somewhat equates with that of water. So the person who performs tayammum is equated with that of wudu or ghusl. So the thing that you are able to do in a state of in having wudu, ablution, then also the same thing is allowed for you in the state of tayammum. Both on equal par regarding what is allowed. So they mentioned that that's the qawl, and that's part of the mention ما يريد الله ليجعل عليكم من الحرج. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not wish to put you upon difficulty. Not wish to put you on difficulty. ولكن يريد ليطهركم, but rather wish to make you pure. So it mentioned that in the last part that the form of purification where the person it is equal to that of water. What's allowed in a state of purification with water is also allowed in the state of purification with tayammum. So that's the call taken by some of those ulama, and Allah mentioned here that the call of Raja, that the second view, the view of Abu Hanifa, Dawood al-Zahiri, some of the Malikiyah, and a riwayah and on Imam Ahmed, that it's a form of, it remove any form of impurities, religious impurity, and the person is in a state of purity on this matter. So they mention also of those who are aligned to this view or ascribe to that view, the second view, that is Ibn Taymiyyah, also Ibn Qayyim in his book Zadul Ma'ad, San'ani in his explanation of Bulugh al-Maram, titled Subul al-Salam, also Abdul Rahman al-Sa'di, that in his book, also Shaykh bin Baz and Ibn Usaymin. So those are more contemporary of the ulama that align to the view that the person in a state of performing tayammum is allowed for the person to is equal to that of in a state of tahara by way of ma, wudu. Ibn Usaymin, because somebody mentioned what is attached to this discussion. So what also goes along with this particular discussion, that as for those who mention that it's only allowed for a person, to Ibn Usaymin, rahimahullah ta'ala, clarify that a person, those jumhur who have the view that it is only allowed for a person to carry out a particular act, they mentioned that with this, that the person have the intention for that act. So the person who make tayammum, it has to be, for example, Salatul Dhuhr. After Salatul Dhuhr, for Salatul Dhuhr only. So with this, he's not allowed to make the nafila before or after Dhuhr, because the intention is directed to that act of Salatul Dhuhr. So that's what comes, so that's all the things that, the ramification of that view. So, so it's not allowed for the person to do more or more than what he have the intention for. He's not allowed to exceed go beyond what he intends regarding if it is done just for that act of ibadah, which would be salat. As we know, concern a person without the intention either for the salat al-farida, then he stick with that, as he cannot have the intention. So that's the view. Or you have an intention for reading of the mushaf, then that to be tayammum for that purpose directly and specifically, and nothing else. So that's the view of those who say it is for that act of ibadah. Also with that view, immediately as the person carry out that act, then that also with this, then his tayammum becomes invalid. After you have carried out the act that he intended to fulfill, then that tayammum becomes invalid. So let's also go along with that matter. So with this of the next masail that they discuss, so I said that overall that qawl of those of Abu Hanifa, Dawood al-Zahiri, and others that mention that the person with this, that if he performed tayammum for dhuhr, during the time of dhuhr, he can pray the nawafil, regardless of the format of raf al-hadath. He can do whatever he would normally do in a state of tahara. Pray nawafil, pray the fard, read the Quran, and it is not nullified except for a valid reason, for a valid nullifier of wudu, or he finds water. So that's concerning that discussion. The next of those masail that are covered, al-yashtarit li-tayammum niyyah. The person after have an intention in performing of carrying out of tayammum. So of the ulama who have mentioned that tayammum requires a niyyah, as mentioned by Ibn Qudama in his book Al-Mughni, لا نعلم خلافا في أن التيمم لا يصلح إلا بالنية. That he doesn't know of any difference between the ulama, that tayammum, it requires an intention for it to be valid. It requires an intention. But they mention that فقد حكي, it is mentioned, it is said that Al-Awza'i, Hassan ibn Saleh, that they said it now that intention is not required for tayammum. So it's something that is said upon Awza'i wal Hassan ibn Saleh, that intention is not required for tayammum. But Jumhur of the ulama mentioned that is something which is wajib. It is having an intention for with tayammum, it is wajib. And that's the view taken by Al-Rabi'a, Imam Malik, Layth ibn Sa'd, Al-Shafi'i, Abu Ubaid, Abu Thur, Ibn Mundhir, Ashab al-Rahi. So majority of the ulama mentioned that it is a requirement. And as mentioned by Subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَمَا أُمِرُوا إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُ اللَّهِ مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ. So they mentioned that ayah that indicate that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not command except you worship him with sincerity. So an-niyyah with acts of ibadat, that an-niyyah is a criteria. Niyyah is a must, it's a condition. They discuss what are some of the criteria regarding tayammum. So of those criteria that one have to be mindful of in matters relating to tayammum. That the ulama have mentioned regarding of the intention of one that with tayammum, that not finding of water or not having access to water. So not having access to water. So that's the intention I mentioned. So with tayammum, condition attached to it, the prerequisite of tayammum is that a person not having access to water. So not having access to water, that's the primary condition of tayammum. That's the main condition of tayammum. The hadith of Hudayfa mentioned, إِذَا لَمْ نَجْدَ الْمَاءِ. So regarding tayammum mentioned, إِذَا لَمْ نَجْدَ الْمَاءِ, if we did not find water. So that's of the primary condition of tayammum. And also in the ayah mentioned Surah Al-Ma'idah, and it mentioned in kuntum marda, that it mentioned the ayah that it mentioned فَلَمْ تَجِدُوا مَاءً فَتَيَمَّمُوا سَعِيدًا طَيِّبًا. So from that it mentioned that the person performing tayammum is attached to the the not having access to water, inavailability of water. So if water is not present or have access to water, is not available, then, or access is there but not access, then that's of the criteria regarding tayammum. Or it mentioned al-marad, or regarding the person's state of marad, also of the criteria, the person may have access to water, but in a case of marad, he is not well. He's not well, and water could impact, using of water could severely affect that person. So in those cases, the person can make tayammum. The person can make tayammum. So ulama mentioned that the person is required for the person seeking of, so having water, that's of those things that are of the criteria. After the next matter discussed by the ulama regarding tayammum, that they mention, is it a requirement for tayammum to be valid that the time of the salat must have entered? So the person wish to performing is time for dhuhr, and there's no water, or the time of dhuhr is coming in, the person looking forward to pray salatul dhuhr. So it's 12 o'clock, but salat of dhuhr, it comes in at 1 o'clock, and the person does not have access or have the availability of water. So 1 o'clock has entered, and the person wish to pray dhuhr, then should the person then perform, is he allowed to perform tayammum before 1 o'clock, or he has to wait until 1 o'clock? So that's the matter. So dukhul al-waqt. So for tayammum to be valid, does the person have to wait until the actual time have entered for that salat, or is it allowed for him to do it before the time? So on that matter, the ulama, they mentioned that ذهب أحمد وشافعي ومالك إلى اشتراط دخول الوقت. So those are imma الثلاثة, Ahmad, Shafi, Malik, that they put as a requirement, they stipulate as a requirement that for tayammum to be valid, that the time of that salat must have entered. So the person has to make tayammum after the time of that salat has entered. So they mention لأنه طهارة ضرورة, because a form of like necessity. So the form of necessity, according to them. So based upon this, the person is only allowed to perform tayammum when the time of the salat have entered. Anything before then is not allowed, and it is not considered to be valid. So the second opinion take the view of Abu Hanifa, that it is correct. The person is allowed to, as mentioned by Abu Hanifa, إلى أنه يصح التيمم قبل وقت الصلاة. That Abu Hanifa, عليه رحمة الله تعالى, is of the opinion that it is allowed for a person to make tayammum even before the time of the salat has entered. So again, as we stated, the example, dhuhr comes in at 1 o'clock. The person, according to them, if he was to perform tayammum at 12:30, 12 o'clock, before 1 o'clock, it is still valid for a person to pray dhuhr, as they do not see it as a condition that the time of that salat must enter. So it could be done before that salat. So that's concerning that of the matter. So the person mentioned that it can be done before the time of the salat it enters. So that's also they mentioned that now overall that the author of some of these books, that of Fatul Alam, that is more inclined towards the second view of the view of Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah ta'ala, ta'ala, that it is allowed to perform tayammum before the time of the salat enters. And also the person remain upon his tayammum even for the next salah. Even for the next salat, if he hasn't done anything that nullify his tayammum or tahara. Those were some of the masahil that relates to this particular hadith that we can mention, and we'll mention others as we go along. But of those things that we mention, some of the fawaid that is mentioned by others, amongst them Ibn Uthaymeen. So of those fawaid that mentioned by Ibn Uthaymeen regarding discussing of these particular hadith in his explanation of Bulugh Al-Maram. So he mentioned of the fawaid, he mentioned that is minnatullah subhanahu wa ta'ala ala hadhi ummah. That is like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is a favor of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon this ummah, where it has given this ummah and his Prophet alayhi salam regarding certain khasa'is. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have favored this nation compared to a previous nation where we have many khasa'is, things that are particular to this nation that were not given to a nation before. And this hadith, it's mentioned some of these. So this hadith, it mentions some of those favors that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have granted this nation, that and allowances that were not given to a previous nation before. So this of the nation that it mentioned that, as I also mentioned, kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat lin-nas. So of those favors, the Prophet also mentioned that this nation is of the best of nation compared to a previous nation. So this hadith, it mentioned a list of things that are particular to this nation that were not given to a nation before. Then also they discuss regarding concerning that, that these favors that are given to the Prophet ﷺ, also it includes his nation, unless there's something to say otherwise. So these favors, these special concessions that are given to the Prophet ﷺ, it also includes his nation, unless there's something to say otherwise. So of those things regarding concerning that the earth is a masjid, where all ulama mentioned that the benefit that that's for the Prophet and also his nation. So any Muslim can pray outside a masjid, in his home, in the field, in the park, that if he prays in these areas, then his salat is valid. So salat is not accepted only in the masjid, but also outside the masjid, contrary to what nation before were upon regarding their acts of worship to be done in the masajid or their salah. Also, they mention that even the Prophet Islam compared to other Anbiya. So also the favors of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon the Prophet Islam compared to other Anbiya, other of the prophets that came before him. Also they mentioned that Husn Talim, that the Prophet Islam regarded of teaching of his nation by listing these things to show regarding to so teaching of nation regarding things that we are somewhat exempt from compared to other nation. So clarifying those things to his nation, and also mention them as a favor to his nation, and for us, this nation, to appreciate these favors that have been given to us, to make things more easier for us compared to nations that were before. So things were maybe more rigid for nations before compared to what we were, that what we are allowed, compared to what we were allowed. And of those benefits, which are many, that the Prophet have mentioned in hadith, of those benefits that they mentioned regarding, that of those silah, that weapon regarding, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed this fear upon the enemies for a distance of a month journey. That so there's like a fear that is placed upon in the hearts of the enemies of Islam. And I mentioned that this is that ulama discuss, is this of this rub in the hearts of the kuffar, the enemies, is this particular to the Prophet Islam and that time, or it is something that it remains with the believers ila qiyamusa. So this fear in the hearts of the believers towards this fear towards the believer, is this something which is particular to the Prophet Islam and the ummah then, or something that it remains forever? The ulama mentions that it is something which seems to remain forever. It of those things that remain forever. Then the Shaykh mentioned that asbab regarding concern the enemies of Islam having fear for the Muslim, that is something that still remain. But also you might find that due to and not the Muslim not being victorious and having the upper hand against the enemies of Islam, that this may occur due to shortcomings amongst ourselves. And I mentioned regarding concerning asbab, that khudlan, that reason why we can somewhat not we have fall away from these things, and these things that have been removed from us. He mentioned of those things because of that amongst this nation of Muhammad alayhi salam, that ma'asi, the widespread of ma'asi amongst us, may remove this fear. Also, i'jab bin nafs, we become kind of somewhat arrogant, having arrogance, and also other things, adam al-ikhlas fi jihad wa ikhlas in general. So when these things have creep amongst the Muslim, we have so you find that the enemies have lost that fear of the Muslim, that we don't rule, and this addition from myself, not from the Sheikh, but also without ruling in Muslim, not ruling by what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have revealed, so not ruling by what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed, then the enemies, they lose this fear of the Muslim, because we're trying to copy them. Tashabbub al-kuffar, we try to imitate the kuffar. So you find that when these things are present amongst us, then the enemies, they lose that sense of fear from us, or that fear of us. When I mentioned the Sheikh also, he commented the point when the hadith mentioned that the share from the hadith, and we discussed that point. We mentioned ju'lat li ard masjidan wa tahura. When I mentioned the hadith, they mentioned that the earth had been made for him a masjid and a place for purification. That's a shahid from the hadith that he mentioned regarding concerning with this matter, that it shows regarding that the masjid, a person is allowed to pray inside the building of the masjid, and that ulama discussed that, and also outside the masjid. So we have buildings that are referred to as masajid, that the Muslim are allowed to pray salatul jama'ah and other salat inside those buildings, but also we are allowed to pray outside the masajid, in our homes, in our workplace, and in the parks, in open areas. We are allowed to pray generally outside the masajid. We are allowed to pray. But he mentioned that with that being said, also there are certain places on the earth that we are not allowed to pray. So you have certain texts that kind of somewhat exempt certain areas of us praying in those places. And after ulama have discussed those matters, they are mentioned different places mentioned by way of text. So there's exemption regarding praying anywhere. There's exemption regarding praying anywhere. The nation before that they were restricted to pray within their masajid. Nation before that they were restricted to pray within their masajid, or their places of worship, their kana'is, other places of worship. They mention regarding those places that are said to be exempt. We're not allowed to pray in those areas. They mention makan najas, so places that are said to be najas, places that are said to be impure, filthy, then we're not allowed to pray in those places. So those are the exceptions regarding the hadith. So places where people might defecate, places where people urinate, they leave garbage, then we're not allowed to pray in those places. We're not allowed to pray in places where there's filth. Also, they mentioned the Sheikh mentioned, we just highlight some of those places he mentioned, places are said to be maqbara. So graveyards, we're not allowed to pray in graveyards. Where he mentioned the hadith, the Prophet mentioned, La tusallu ila qubur. The Prophet mentioned the hadith, La tusallu ila qubur, the hadith in the Sahih Muslim, that we are not allowed to pray to the graves, to the grave. That's the hadith he mentioned, towards the grave. And also even the hadith, the Prophet mentioned this hadith, that I mentioned that hadith, that it said isnad labas, a discussion regarding the isnad, but I mentioned isnad labas. قال عليه السلام الحديث الأرض كلها مسجدا إلا مقبرة وحمام. But the Prophet mentioned in this hadith that the entire earth is a masjid except the graveyard and hammam. So then the Shaykh mentioned, so the hadith showed that maqbara, graveyards, is not a place for salat. Graveyard is not a place for salat. A discussion that he kind of somewhat slightly mentioned, that a person is not allowed to pray in like a graveyard. No salat with that is a farida or nafila. So whatever is said within the graveyard, one is not allowed to pray in that area. You might have an area where it's like a car park, where cars might park within the graveyard, or you have an open area space. The person also not allowed to pray is salat inside the graveyard, with the exception of the salat salat. So general concern, a person is not allowed to pray is normal salat inside the graveyard. So normal salat is not allowed to pray inside the graveyard. And so I find that so is of the view, and of the ulama of the view, that what the entry and where the fence, then that's the boundary of the graveyard. So whatever is beyond the fence, within the fence of the graveyard, the boundary of the graveyard, where it is being used now or not being used, or people have been buried there or not buried there, the fact that it is considered to be off the graveyard, the maqbara, the burial ground, then you're not allowed to pray there. That's the view that is taken by some of the ulama. Without. So the next matter discussed concerning a third place that we are not allowed to pray, mentioned hush wal hammam. So hush, regarding concerning hush, would be like the toilet, the place that for toilet, and the hammam for the place of taking a bath. So places that are used for taking of bath, washing of oneself, or for one to use as the toilet area to relieve oneself, qada al-haja, then one is not allowed to pray inside those areas. Then also he mentioned another of those places that an la an takuna as-salat ila al-qabr, also not to pray towards a grave. So a person should not have a grave in front of him praying towards it. Then as the Prophet mentioned, la tusallu ila al-qubur, that not to pray towards the grave, meaning not to face the grave to be your qibla when praying. And I mentioned that that is a form of protection against falling into shirk, that leads to shirk. And also second, it's a way of resembling the way of the Ahli Kitab. Ahli Kitab, that they give a lot of emphasis and importance and reverence to grave. And unfortunately, we find some of the Muslim, Allah Musta'an, are those who claim Islam, that they have fallen into this. That we find of those who claim to be Muslim, that they are heavily involved in giving a lot of importance to grave and tombs and the likes. For Allah Musta'an. Then I mentioned also of those things, places and other places that we are not allowed to pray. So those are of those places that we are not allowed to pray. So there's an exception to the rule. There's an exception to the rule. So those are those matters that are mentioned regarding. Then, so that's concerning the hadith that is mentioned today, of those three hadith: the hadith of Jabir, the hadith of Hudayfa, and third, the hadith of Ali ibn Abi Talib, that give us an understanding regarding that these hadith, it prove the permissibility of tayammum. So those hadith that it prove the permissibility, and it is something which is legislated within the Sharia, that we are allowed to perform tayammum, whether the person is a traveler or the person is residential, with the condition the person allowed tayammum, the person does not have access to water or the availability of water. And we'll discuss other points relating to this, but these are some of the points relating to this particular discussion. With this, inshallah ta'ala, will end and continue next for the next session. So this, inshallah ta'ala, as we mentioned, that we're in the bab of tayammum, an important discussion, and we'll discuss the remaining ahadith in this particular chapter. وبالله تعالى توفيق وهذه السبيل والآخر دعوانا الحمد لله آمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. أستغفر الله. Okay, so how long was that?